The gorge was a scar carved deep into the desert floor, a place where the earth had split open centuries ago and never healed. Dr. Elena Voss stood at its entrance, her shadow stretching long and thin across the cracked stone that marked the threshold between the open wasteland and the narrow corridor ahead. The walls rose 40 feet on either side, sheer faces of rust-colored rock that absorbed the afternoon heat and radiated it back in shimmering waves. She'd been walking for 6 days through terrain that offered no mercy, and the gorge represented both promise and threat, a passage through the mountains that could save her 3 days of travel, or a trap from which there might be no escape. The heat was a physical presence, pressing against her skin like a blanket woven from fire. Even through her desert-rated clothing, lightweight fabric designed to wick moisture and reflect solar radiation, she felt the sun's assault as a constant drain on her body's resources. Her shirt was stained with salt rings, where sweat had evaporated repeatedly, leaving behind the minerals her body was losing with each drop of precious moisture. Her cargo pants, once khaki, were now darkened with dust and grime, the knees worn thin from the times she'd crawled through narrow spaces or knelt to examine terrain features. 6 days ago, she'd been part of a 12-person university expedition studying geological formations and potential archaeological sites in the eastern desert territories. The team had been well-equipped, well-supplied, with satellite communications and emergency beacons, with vehicles and support personnel, with every advantage modern technology could provide. Then the sandstorm had come, a wall of wind and particles that had turned day into night, that had scattered the expedition and destroyed their carefully laid plans in the span of 3 hours. Elena had been on the perimeter with 2 graduate students, taking core samples from a promising formation when the storm hit. She'd made the decision to shelter behind a rock outcrop rather than try to navigate back to the main camp in zero visibility. It was the right call tactically, but it had separated her from the group. When the storm finally passed 30 hours later, she'd emerged to find the graduate students gone. Whether they'd tried to make it back to camp or had been forced to seek shelter elsewhere, she couldn't know. The outcrop had protected her, but had also isolated her. Her left ankle throbbed with each step, the ligament strained from a fall 2 days prior when loose shale had given way beneath her boots. She'd wrapped it as best she could with strips torn from her spare shirt, but the swelling pressed against the makeshift bandage with persistent discomfort. The strap of her pack had rubbed her right shoulder raw, the weight of her remaining supplies. 2 liters of water, emergency rations depleted to their final third, a first aid kit running low, flares, rope, and the geological survey equipment that had brought her out here in the first place, digging into flesh already tender from days of exposure. Her lips were cracked and bleeding despite the petroleum jelly she applied each morning and evening. Her face was wind-burned, her hands calloused and scraped, her muscles aching with the deep exhaustion that came from pushing the body beyond its natural limits day after day. She pulled the water bottle from her pack's side pocket and allowed herself 3 small swallows. The liquid was warm, tasting faintly of plastic and minerals, but it was salvation measured in precious ounces. She had to reach the research station on the far side of the mountain range within 2 days, or the water would run out. The gorge would cut her travel time, but only if it remained passable, only if the way ahead stayed clear. Elena adjusted the wide-brimmed hat that protected her face from the sun, now hanging lower in the western sky, but still fierce, still punishing. She'd left the university expedition camp after the sandstorm had separated her from the main group, after communications had failed, after waiting 3 days for rescue that never came. The decision to move had been calculated but desperate. Stay and risk dying of thirst in a camp that might never be found, or walk toward the only installation she knew existed in this vast emptiness. She'd chosen motion over stillness, action over hope. The entrance to the gorge yawned before her, 20 feet wide where she stood, but narrowing ahead into passages that looked barely sufficient for a single person. She studied the walls, The way shadows pooled in crevices, the striations in the rock that told stories of ancient floods and geological upheaval. This had once been a riverbed, millions of years ago, when water still flowed through these lands. Now it was as dry as bone, as silent as a tomb. She stepped forward, boots crunching on the mixture of sand and stone that formed the floor. The temperature dropped immediately, the walls blocking the direct sunlight, offering the first genuine relief she'd felt since morning. She paused to let her body adjust, feeling the sweat on her face begin to cool, feeling her shoulders relax marginally. The gorge floor sloped gently downward, which meant she'd be descending into the mountain's heart, traveling through passages carved by forces that predated human history. The first 100 yards was straightforward, the walls maintaining their distance, the path clear of obstacles. Elena's footsteps echoed slightly, a soft percussion that marked her passage. She kept her eyes moving, scanning the walls for cracks that might indicate instability, watching the ground for sinkholes or loose sections that could give way. Desert terrain was deceptive. What looked solid could collapse without warning, and what seemed impassable sometimes offered hidden routes. The gorge began to narrow. The walls closed in until they were only 12 feet apart, then 10, then 8. The light dimmed as the walls blocked more of the sky, creating a twilight environment even though the sun still blazed above. Elena's breathing sounded louder in the confined space, each exhale a small assertion of life in a place that felt abandoned by everything living. She saw no plants, no insects, no signs of animal life. The gorge was sterile, a passage through stone that offered nothing but transit. After another quarter mile, the walls were close enough that she could touch both sides if she extended her arms. The passage twisted left, then right, following fracture lines in the ancient bedrock. Elena's injured ankle protested on the uneven surface, sending sharp complaints up her leg with each awkward step. She gritted her teeth and continued, maintaining the steady pace that had carried her this far. Stop too long, and the body would convince the mind that it couldn't go on. Keep moving, and eventually you arrived somewhere, even if that somewhere was simply a different kind of nowhere. She rounded a sharp bend and stopped. The gorge ahead widened into a natural amphitheater, a circular space perhaps 30 feet in diameter, where the walls pulled back and the ceiling opened to reveal a perfect circle of blue sky. In the center of this space, half buried in wind-blown sand, stood the remains of a structure. Not natural rock, but carved stone, pillars that had once supported something now long gone, lintels that had fallen and broken into pieces, fragments of walls that suggested rooms, doorways, purpose. Elena felt her pulse quicken. Ruins. She'd heard stories from the local guides, fragments of legends about cities swallowed by the desert, civilizations that had thrived before the climate changed, before the water vanished. The university expedition had been searching for exactly this kind of archaeological evidence, proof that human settlement had once extended much further into regions now considered uninhabitable. She approached slowly, her mind already cataloguing details despite her exhaustion. The stone was limestone, weathered, but still showing traces of decorative carving, geometric patterns that suggested a sophisticated aesthetic sensibility. The pillars were cylindrical, approximately 2 feet in diameter, spaced at regular intervals that implied architectural planning. This had been a significant structure, not a simple shelter or waypoint, but a building of importance. Elena knelt beside one of the fallen lintels, running her fingers over the carved surface. The patterns were unlike anything she'd seen in her research on regional ancient cultures. The style was distinctive, clearly intentional, speaking to a culture that had valued beauty alongside function. She wished she had her camera equipment, wished she could document this properly, but the storm had destroyed most of her electronics. She had only her notebook and pencil, and even those were luxury items given her current situation. She stood and moved toward what appeared to be an entrance, a doorway that descended into the ground rather than rising above it. Stone steps led downward, disappearing into shadow after the first 6 or 7. The opening was roughly rectangular, carved with precision that defied the simplistic tools she'd assumed ancient desert peoples possessed. This required planning, mathematical knowledge, engineering skill. The rational part of Elena's mind urged caution. Unexplored ruins could contain structural hazards, unstable floors, pockets of toxic gas from decomposing organic material, any number of dangers. But the scientist in her was drawn forward, curious about what lay below, what secrets might be preserved in the cool darkness beneath the surface. She pulled her flashlight from her pack and tested it. The beam was strong, the batteries still good. She'd been conservative with its use, knowing that once the light was gone, certain activities became impossible. This seemed like an appropriate use of resources, a brief exploration of a potentially significant discovery, something that might provide shelter for the night if the lower chambers proved stable and safe. Elena descended the stairs carefully, testing each step before committing her full weight. The stone was solid, undamaged by time, cool to the touch. The temperature dropped with each step, the air becoming noticeably colder, carrying a faint mineral scent that suggested depth, spaces that had been sealed away from the surface for a very long time. At the bottom of the stairs, perhaps 15 feet below the surface, she found herself in a corridor. The flashlight beam revealed walls covered in more of the geometric carvings, along with something new, pictographs, stylized representations of figures and animals, and symbols whose meaning had been lost to time. Elena moved the light slowly across the images, trying to make sense of the narrative they might contain. The air down here was different, carrying a coolness that was almost shocking after days of desert heat, but also something else. A mineral scent that reminded her of deep caves she'd explored during her graduate work, places where water had once flowed through limestone, leaving behind the chemical signature of its passage. But there should be no water here, no moisture to create that distinctive smell. The desert had been arid for thousands of years. The water table dropped so low that even deep wells came up dry. Yet the scent was unmistakable, speaking to geological mysteries she couldn't immediately explain. She saw human figures, or at least humanoid shapes, rendered in the stylized manner common to ancient pictographic traditions. They were shown in profile, engaging in activities that seemed to involve the maintenance or construction of the structure itself, carrying stones, arranging materials, participating in what might have been ceremonial activities. She saw what might be representations of the desert or the sky or water. The symbol appeared repeatedly, a wavy line with dots above it, suggesting importance to the people who had created these images. Perhaps it represented a time when water still flowed here, when this region supported life in abundance. But it was the other images that drew her attention with growing unease. She saw creatures that looked vaguely reptilian, but wrong somehow, with bodies that seemed too long, too sinuous to be natural, with proportions that suggested something adapted to movement through sand rather than across it. The creatures were depicted in various contexts, sometimes small and distant, sometimes large and threatening, sometimes surrounding the human figures in compositions that clearly indicated danger or conflict. And there were scenes that told a darker story. She saw human figures fleeing, their postures conveying panic even through the limitations of pictographic art. She saw structures collapsing, walls crumbling, entire buildings shown in states of destruction. And she saw the creatures emerging from below, breaking through floors and foundations, their elongated forms rising from the depths in numbers that filled the available space in the compositions. This wasn't myth or legend rendered symbolic. This was documentation, a warning left by people who had experienced something catastrophic, who had witnessed their civilization destroyed by something that came from beneath the ground. The pictographs were a testament to survival and loss, a message passed forward through millennia that these lands held dangers beyond the obvious threats of heat and thirst. A chill ran through Elena that had nothing to do with the cool air. She was reading too much into ancient art, letting her exhaustion and isolation create narratives that might not exist. Pictographs were notoriously difficult to interpret, their meanings often lost without cultural context. She was projecting her own fears and experiences onto images that likely represented something completely mundane: a creation myth, a seasonal cycle, a historical event rendered symbolic through artistic convention. The corridor extended ahead, straight and level, the walls maintaining their parallel relationship. Elena walked slowly, playing the flashlight beam across surfaces, looking for structural concerns. The ceiling was perhaps 8 feet high, constructed of fitted stones that showed no signs of sagging or failure. The engineering was remarkable, the preservation even more so. This place had been sealed somehow, protected from the erosive forces that had destroyed the surface structure. After 30 yards, the corridor opened into a chamber. Elena stepped through the doorway and swept her light around the space, revealing a room roughly 20 feet square with a ceiling that rose in a gentle dome. In the center stood a stone platform, circular, approximately 6 feet in diameter, its surface carved with concentric rings that spiraled inward toward a central point. The walls bore more pictographs, these ones showing the elongated creatures more prominently, their forms repeated in various poses and positions. Elena approached the platform cautiously, examining the carved rings. They were precise, mathematical in their spacing, decreasing in diameter according to what looked like a consistent ratio. This was sophisticated geometric work, requiring tools and knowledge that challenged conventional understanding of ancient desert peoples' capabilities. She was so focused on the platform that she almost missed the change in air pressure. It was subtle, a sensation more than a sound, a feeling that the space around her had somehow shifted. She froze, listening intently. The chamber was silent, but the quality of that silence had changed. It felt less empty, less abandoned. It felt observed. Elena turned slowly, moving the flashlight beam across the walls. Nothing. The doorway through which she'd entered remained empty, the corridor beyond visible in the reflected light. She was alone. She had to be alone. This place had been sealed for centuries at minimum, possibly millennia. There was no one else here. But the feeling persisted, that subtle pressure that suggested presence, awareness, attention, focused on her from somewhere in the darkness beyond her light's reach. She recognized the sensation from her research trips to caves and abandoned mines. The mind playing tricks in unfamiliar environments, creating phantom sensations from the absence of expected stimuli. She was experiencing sensory deprivation effects, exhaustion-induced paranoia, nothing more. Elena backed toward the doorway, keeping the flashlight moving, maintaining visual coverage of the chamber. She'd seen enough. This was a significant discovery, something that would require a proper archaeological team with appropriate equipment and expertise. Her job now was to survive, to reach the research station, to report this location so that others could return and study it properly. She reached the corridor and turned to retrace her steps. The flashlight beam swept ahead, illuminating the passage, showing the carved walls and the distant stairs leading back to the surface. She walked quickly, no longer interested in careful examination, focused solely on extraction. The corridor felt longer going back, the stairs further away than they should be. When she finally reached them and climbed back into the circular chamber above, the light had changed. The sun had moved significantly, the circle of sky visible above now showing the deep blue of late afternoon. She'd been below longer than she'd realized, easily an hour lost to exploration and examination. She needed to move, needed to continue through the gorge before darkness made navigation impossible. Elena shouldered her pack and turned toward the continuation of the passage. The gorge walls closed in again beyond the circular chamber, narrowing back to the confined corridor she'd been following. She entered the passage and immediately noticed something wrong. The sand beneath her feet was disturbed, not by wind. There was no wind in the gorge, no breeze to shift surface particles. The disturbance was more significant, a displacement of sand that created shallow waves across the passage floor, patterns that radiated from some central point ahead, as if something had moved beneath the surface and pushed the sand upward in the process. Elena stopped, studying the patterns. They were fresh, created within the last hour, possibly within the last few minutes. The sand in this region was fine and dry, moved easily, but held its shape well in the absence of wind. These waves hadn't been here when she'd entered the circular chamber. Something had created them while she was below ground. She looked up at the gorge walls, searching for signs of rockfall or collapse that might have transmitted vibrations through the ground. The walls were intact, showing no fresh damage, no dust that would indicate recent movement. The disturbance had come from below, not above. Eleanor's grip tightened on her pack straps. She thought about the pictographs in the underground chamber, the elongated creatures depicted in various poses. She thought about the representations of something pursuing from below, figures running, walls crumbling. Ancient art created by people who had lived in this region, who had known this desert intimately, who had documented something they considered significant enough to record in permanent form. She pushed the thoughts aside. Correlation wasn't causation. Ancient warnings weren't reliable guides to current reality. The sand displacement could have dozens of mundane explanations: seismic activity, settling in underground caverns, temperature differentials creating movement in the substrate. She was letting exhaustion and isolation create phantom threats from ambiguous evidence. But she couldn't deny the feeling that had started in the underground chamber, that sense of being observed, of presence where logic insisted there should be none. And now this, fresh evidence of disturbance in a place that should be static, unchanged, dead. Eleanor started walking again, moving carefully, placing her feet deliberately, trying not to disturb the sand more than necessary. The passage ahead continued its twisting path through the gorge, walls close on either side, ceiling open to the darkening sky. She wanted to move faster, wanted to run, but forced herself to maintain a steady pace. Panic was the enemy in survival situations. Panic led to mistakes, to injuries, to poor decisions that compounded problems instead of solving them. The waves in the sand continued ahead, becoming more pronounced as she progressed. They no longer radiated from a single point, but ran parallel to the gorge walls, as if something had moved along the passage, staying beneath the surface, following the natural corridor. The patterns were distinct, deliberate, speaking to movement rather than settling, to agency rather than geological process. Elena's breathing quickened despite her efforts to remain calm. She was seeing what she was seeing. The evidence was real, physical, undeniable. Something had moved through this gorge recently, something that traveled beneath the sand, something large enough to displace significant amounts of material. She increased her pace, no longer concerned with stealth or caution, focused solely on forward motion. The gorge twisted left, then right. The walls so close now she could touch both simultaneously. The sand waves continued, parallel tracks that spoke to something moving with purpose, with direction, with an intelligence that understood the geography it traveled. The passage began to widen, the walls pulling back gradually, and Elena felt a surge of relief. Open space meant options, meant room to maneuver if something went wrong. She emerged into another widening, smaller than the circular chamber, but still offering 30 feet of clearance between the walls. The sand here was deeply disturbed, showing multiple patterns of displacement, suggesting that whatever created the tracks had spent time in this location, had circled perhaps, or gathered with others of its kind. Elena stopped in the center of the space, turning slowly, studying the patterns. Multiple tracks meant multiple entities. The disturbances overlapped in places, making it difficult to count exactly how many had been here, but her best estimate suggested at least 3, possibly 4 or 5, and the tracks were all recent, all created within the last few hours, at most. She was in the middle of their territory. That's what this was. Not a random passage through the mountains, but a hunting ground. A corridor that something used regularly, a path traveled by creatures adapted to subterranean movement through desert terrain. The scientist in Elena noted the implications with detached fascination. The existence of large, burrowing fauna in this environment suggested evolutionary adaptations she could barely imagine. Methods of thermoregulation in extreme heat, navigation systems that worked underground, sensory apparatus suited to detecting prey or threats through layers of sand and stone. This was a discovery of potentially enormous significance, evidence of desert ecology far more complex than current scientific understanding acknowledged. But the part of Elena that wanted to survive, the part that understood she was alone and injured and running out of time, that part was screaming at her to move, to get out of this gorge, to reach open ground where she could see threats coming, where she'd have space to react. She started running, or as close to running as her injured ankle would allow. The gorge continued ahead, narrowing again, and she plunged into the confined passage without hesitation. Behind her, she heard something that might have been sand shifting, or might have been something larger, something deliberate. She didn't look back, didn't slow down, focused all her attention on the path ahead and the requirement to keep moving. The walls blurred past her peripheral vision. The ground passed beneath her stumbling feet. Her breath came in ragged gasps that echoed off the stone. The pack bounced against her back, the straps digging deeper into her shoulders, the weight throwing off her balance. Her ankle screamed with each impact, the pain sharp and immediate, but she ignored it, pushed through it, accepted it as the price of motion. The gorge twisted sharply left, then almost immediately right, and Elena nearly lost her footing on the turn. She caught herself against the wall, her palms scraping on the rough stone, and pushed off to continue. The passage ahead looked different, darker somehow, the walls closer, the ceiling lower. She was descending again, following the gorge deeper into the mountain. And then she heard it clearly, unmistakably. The sound of sand moving in volume, of something large displacing material as it traveled. The sound came from behind her, from the passage she'd just run through, and it was getting closer. Whatever created the tracks was no longer passive, no longer simply moving through its territory. It was pursuing. Elena forced more speed from her exhausted body, every instinct screaming danger, every nerve firing warnings that something predatory had locked onto her position. The gorge continued to descend, the walls pressing closer, and she realized with horror that she was entering a section where the passage narrowed to barely 3 feet across. She'd have to turn sideways to fit through, would have to slow down, would be vulnerable if something caught her in that confined space. She had no choice. Forward was the only direction that mattered. She turned sideways and pushed into the narrow section, the stone scraping her pack on one side and her chest on the other. The passage extended ahead for at least 20 feet of this constricted width, a geological feature created by differential erosion, a natural bottleneck that she had to navigate. Behind her, the sound of movement grew louder. She could hear it clearly now, not just sand shifting, but something organic, something breathing, something large enough that its passage created turbulence in the air. She pushed harder into the narrow space, ignoring the scraping, ignoring the way the walls seemed to squeeze against her ribs, ignoring everything except the need to get through this section and back into space where she could move. The passage widened abruptly, and Elena stumbled forward into a larger chamber. She turned, pulling the flashlight from her belt and directing it back at the narrow section she'd just traversed. The beam illuminated the confined space, showing the parallel walls, showing the sand on the floor, disturbed by her passage. And then the sand began to move, not from wind, not from settling, but from something beneath it. The surface lifted in a wave that ran along the length of the narrow passage, a displacement of material that suggested something sinuous, something elongated, something that moved with the fluid grace of a serpent, but on a scale that defied her ability to process. Elena backed away from the opening, her heart hammering, her mind struggling to reconcile what she was seeing with any framework of known biology. The wave of sand reached the widening where she stood and stopped, as if whatever created it had paused, was considering, was deciding whether to continue pursuit into the more open space. She played the flashlight beam across the disturbed sand, trying to see beneath it, trying to catch a glimpse of what moved below. The sand settled slowly, the wave flattening, returning to apparent stillness. But Elena could feel the presence, could sense the attention focused on her from just beneath the surface, separated from her by mere inches of sand and stone. For a long moment, nothing happened. Elena stood frozen, barely breathing, the flashlight beam steady on the sand. She wanted to run, but knew that movement might trigger a response, might provoke whatever waited below into action. Better to stay still, to hope that whatever it was would lose interest, would return to its normal behavior patterns and leave her alone. The sand erupted. Something massive broke through the surface in an explosion of particles and force, something that rose up 10 feet, 12 feet, 15 feet into the air. And for one frozen moment of absolute terror, Elena saw it clearly in the beam of her flashlight. The creature was pale, its flesh the color of sun-bleached limestone, translucent in places where the flashlight penetrated thin layers of tissue and revealed internal structures she couldn't identify. Its body was segmented like an arthropod, but the segments were enormous, each one as thick as her torso, covered in plates that overlapped and shifted with fluid grace as the creature moved. The body extended back into the sand, impossibly long, suggesting a total length of 30 feet or more, perhaps much more. She couldn't see where it ended, couldn't determine if what she was seeing was the entire organism or merely the portion that had breached the surface. The head, if it could be called that, was a nightmare of alien evolution. No eyes that she could identify, no obvious sensory organs that corresponded to mammalian or reptilian features. Instead, there was a ring of appendages at the anterior end, each one perhaps 8 inches long, moving independently like the tentacles of a sea anemone, but rigid at their base, flexible only at their tips. These appendages probed the air, tasting or sensing or perceiving in ways she couldn't comprehend, creating an impression of awareness that was profoundly disturbing. The mouth, and it had to be a mouth, was a circular opening at the center of the appendage ring, lined with structures that might have been teeth or might have been something else entirely, something designed for breaking through sand-compacted barriers or crushing the bodies of prey. The opening dilated as she watched, expanding and contracting rhythmically, and she could see into the throat, could see the muscles working in peristaltic waves, could smell the creature's exhalation, a scent like hot stone and ancient dust, and something organic that suggested digestion, consumption, the processing of nutrients from sources she didn't want to imagine. The creature's body undulated, the segments flexing in coordinated waves that propelled it upward, supporting its massive bulk against gravity through what must have been incredible muscular strength. And then it oriented toward her, the anterior end swinging in her direction with terrible purpose, the sensory appendages all focusing forward, converging on her position with the certainty of a predator that had located its prey. Elena ran. The conscious part of her mind shut down, overridden by pure survival instinct, by the primitive brain structures that understood only flight and the necessity of distance. Her injured ankle screamed with each impact, the pain white-hot and immediate, but she ignored it, pushed through it, accepted that she would pay for this exertion later if there was a later to pay for it. The pack bounced wildly against her back, the straps cutting into her shoulders, the weight throwing her off balance with each stride. But she didn't dare take the time to drop it, didn't dare abandon the water and supplies that represented her only chance of surviving the desert crossing ahead. The chamber behind her echoed with the sound of the creature's movement, the crash of sand and stone as it maneuvered its bulk, as it found the opening through which she'd fled, as it forced its massive body into the passage in pursuit. The sound was immense, overwhelming, speaking to a creature that could reshape its environment through sheer physical force, that could move tons of material with the same ease that she might push through a curtain. And beneath the crashes and impacts, she heard something that might have been vocalization, a deep thrumming that resonated in her chest, that suggested communication or echolocation or some other sensory mechanism she couldn't identify. The gorge ahead split into 3 passages, each one twisting into darkness, each one offering different dimensions and different risks. She chose the leftmost without conscious decision, following some deep instinct that suggested this route offered the best chance. The passage was narrow again, but not as confined as before, allowing her to run at full speed despite her injured ankle, despite her exhaustion, despite the pack that threw her balance and the darkness that made every step a risk of collision or fall. The walls were close enough that she brushed them repeatedly, her shoulders and arms taking impacts that would leave bruises that added new pain to the catalogue her body was compiling. The floor was uneven, scattered with loose stones that rolled beneath her boots, threatening to turn her ankle further or send her sprawling. She ran with her hands outstretched, using the walls for balance and guidance, letting touch compensate for the limited visibility provided by the flashlight beam that jerked and jumped with her motion. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit continued, echoing through the stone, multiplying in the confined spaces until it seemed like there were creatures ahead and behind and on all sides. The gorge played tricks with sound, reflecting it, amplifying it, sending it down side passages and back again in patterns that destroyed any ability to judge distance or direction accurately. She forced herself to focus forward, to ignore the acoustic deception, to trust the path she'd chosen and the reality of what her eyes could see rather than what her ears suggested. The passage began to rise, climbing back toward the surface, and Elena felt a surge of hope. If she could reach open ground, reach space where she could see, she'd have options. The creature was clearly adapted for subterranean or subsand travel, using the loose surface material as a medium through which it moved, with the ease of a fish through water. On solid ground, exposed to air, it would be at a disadvantage. The slope grew steeper, requiring her to use her hands to help climb over sections where the path became nearly vertical. The stone was rough, offering good purchase, but each handhold was agony for her abraded palms. She climbed desperately, her muscles burning, her lungs straining, her vision starting to narrow with the effort. And then she was through, emerging from the gorge onto a high plateau that stretched away toward distant mountains. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, casting long shadows across the broken landscape. Elena stumbled away from the gorge entrance, putting distance between herself and the passage from which she'd emerged. She turned to look back to see if the creature had followed her to the surface. The gorge entrance yawned like a wound in the earth, dark and silent, showing no signs of movement. The sand around the opening was undisturbed, peaceful, suggesting nothing had emerged in pursuit. Elena sank to her knees, her body shaking with exhaustion and aftermath adrenaline. She'd escaped. Whatever lived in those underground passages, it had either lost interest or had reached the limit of its territory. She was alive on the surface, with options again. She forced herself to stand, to keep moving despite every cell in her body demanding rest. The plateau stretched ahead, and somewhere in that direction lay the research station, safety, other people who could verify that she was sane, that what she'd experienced was real. She started walking, favoring her injured ankle, settling into the steady pace that had carried her through 6 days of desert travel. The sky darkened as she walked, stars appearing in the deepening blue. Elena didn't allow herself to stop, didn't allow herself to rest. She walked through the twilight and into the night, navigating by starlight and the gradual slope of the terrain. Her water was nearly gone, her food exhausted, her body approaching the limits of its endurance. But she was alive, she was moving, and tomorrow she would reach the station. As dawn broke over the plateau, painting the landscape in soft gold, Elena saw lights in the distance. The research station, exactly where the maps had indicated, exactly where hope had insisted it would be. She stumbled toward it, her body operating on pure will, her mind already constructing the report she would file, the evidence she would present, the expedition she would organize to return to the gorge and document what lived beneath the desert floor. The station grew larger as she approached, resolving from distant lights into distinct structures. Prefabricated buildings designed for desert research, solar panels glinting in the early sun, satellite dishes pointed skyward, vehicles parked in neat rows. She could see people moving between buildings, conducting the morning routines of a functioning research facility. Safety, civilization, the promise of water and food and medical care for her battered body. Her vision was tunneling, the edges going dark, her body finally acknowledging the accumulated damage and exhaustion of 6 days crossing terrain that should have killed her. Her ankle was a ball of fire, swollen so badly that the boot had become a vice, crushing the injury with each step. Her hands were raw and bleeding, her face wind-burned and sun-damaged, her lips so cracked that they split anew with each breath. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had already been lean, her body consuming its own muscle for fuel when the rations ran out. But she was alive, she was moving, and tomorrow she would reach the station. No, she was reaching it now, this moment, as the distance closed to hundreds of yards, then dozens, as the gates became visible, as guards noticed her approach and began running toward her with concern written across their faces. She'd survived. The desert had tested her with heat and distance and thirst. The darkness had hunted her with creatures adapted to an environment humans barely understood. And she had emerged with knowledge that would reshape understanding of this harsh environment. Evidence that complex predatory species thrived beneath the surface, that ancient peoples had known about these threats and had left warnings for those who came after, that the desert held secrets that science was only beginning to uncover. But as she approached the station's gates, as the personnel rushed out to help her, as safety closed around her like a warm embrace, Elena couldn't shake the memory of that moment in the gorge, the sand lifting in waves, the massive form breaking through the surface, the certainty that she'd glimpsed something that had lived beneath the desert for millennia, adapting, evolving, hunting in ways that defied surface understanding. The creature's anatomy suggested evolution along paths completely divorced from surface fauna. Development in an environment of constant darkness and compressed space, sensory systems that relied on vibration and chemical detection rather than vision or hearing. She collapsed at the gates, her legs finally giving out, surrendering to gravity and exhaustion. Arms caught her. Voices spoke in concerned tones. Someone was calling for medical assistance, and Elena tried to tell them, tried to explain what she'd found in the gorge, but her mouth wouldn't form the words properly, her tongue thick and clumsy from dehydration. They carried her inside, laid her on a cot, began the process of rehydration and assessment and care. A doctor examined her ankle, her hands, her face, cataloguing the damage with professional efficiency. Someone else was recording her vital signs, monitoring her condition, ensuring that her return from the edge wouldn't be undone by the complications of extreme exposure and dehydration. Through it all, Elena held onto consciousness long enough to speak 3 words that would launch the investigations that would follow. Creatures, underground, gorge. The desert had let her go this time, but she knew, with absolute certainty, that it wouldn't forget her presence, that the creatures beneath the sand would remember the intruder who had invaded their territory, and that the next person who ventured into those narrow passages might not be as fortunate as she had been. The sun rose higher, burning away the cool of morning, reasserting the desert's dominance over the landscape. Elena looked back toward the plateau, toward the distant mountains, toward the gorge she could no longer see but would never forget. The desert kept its secrets well, but she had touched one of them, had survived the encounter, and would carry that knowledge forward into whatever came next. If you want more stories from the desert, subscribe to Dark Desert Survival. Each journey into these harsh lands reveals something new about survival, about adaptation, about the creatures that thrive where humans struggle to exist for even a few days. Tell me in the comments which moment shocked you most. Was it the first glimpse of the creature, the underground chamber's warnings, or the desperate climb to freedom? Your thoughts help shape the stories we tell, the survival lessons we share, the understanding we build about this unforgiving environment that continues to challenge everyone who dares to cross its burning sands.